The champagne glass in my hand felt heavier than it should have. The bubbles had gone flat, just like the mood of the room. I stood there, my coaching whistle still hanging around my neck like a noose, as Patricia raised her glass for the toast. Her smile was too wide, her laugh too sharp. "To Scott," she said, her voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. 30 years of dedication, loyalty, and, well, let's just say, persistence. Her friends erupted into laughter, the kind that feels like a secret you're not in on. One of them, a woman I barely knew, leaned over and whispered something to Patricia, who shot me a glance that made my stomach twist. I forced a smile, clinking my glass against the nearest one, the sound hollow and tinny. The retirement plaque on the wall behind me caught the light, its gold lettering mocking me. Scott Thompson, a legacy of leadership. Leadership? Right now, I felt like a man standing in the middle of a joke I didn't understand. Patricia's friends were clustered around her like vultures, their laughter too loud, their smiles too bright. I caught snippets of their conversation, something about a young star and breaking news. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to the stress of the party, but the unease stuck to me like sweat on a summer night. Patricia kept glancing at me, her eyes darting away every time I looked back. She was nervous, more nervous than she should have been. Her fingers tapped against her glass, the rhythm erratic, like a heart skipping beats. I tried to focus on the people who mattered, my players, my friends, my family, but even they seemed distracted, their conversations peppered with awkward pauses and sideways glances. Kevin, my grandson, was the only one who seemed genuinely happy for me. He sat at a table near the back, fiddling with his baseball cap, his eyes bright with admiration. But even he looked over at Patricia and her friends with a frown, like he sensed something was off. The room smelled like cheap perfume and stale champagne, the kind of scent that clings to you long after the party's over. I took a sip from my glass, the taste bitter on my tongue. Patricia's toast echoed in my head. The old fool. Was that how they saw me? A relic? A joke? Someone too out of touch to notice what was happening right under my nose? I gripped the whistle around my neck, the metal cool against my palm. It had been a gift from my first team, a symbol of everything I'd built. Now it felt like a weight dragging me down. As the night wore on, the laughter grew louder, the glances more pointed. I found myself staring at the plaque again, the words blurring together. A legacy of leadership. What kind of legacy was I leaving if even my own wife couldn't look me in the eye? I didn't have answers, just questions that clawed at the edges of my mind. And as I stood there, surrounded by the remnants of a life I thought I understood, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. The party was winding down, the clinking of champagne glasses replaced by the low hum of tired laughter and the occasional scrape of chairs against the hardwood floor. I was standing by the makeshift bar, nursing a watered-down whiskey, when Kevin tugged on my sleeve. His face was pale, his eyes wide like he'd just seen something he wasn't supposed to. The way he looked at me, like he was carrying a weight too heavy for his 12-year-old shoulders, made my stomach drop. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the dull roar of the room. His baseball cap was tilted awkwardly, the brim shadowing his face. "I need to tell you something." I followed him to the corner of the room, near the fireplace where the family photos hung. The heat from the flames was almost too much, but Kevin didn't seem to notice. He fidgeted with the hem of his jersey, his fingers trembling. "I was in the kitchen earlier," he started, his voice cracking. "Aunt Patricia and her friends were talking. They didn't know I was there." I knelt down to his level, the old ache in my knees screaming in protest. "What is it, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But the way he looked at me, like he was about to deliver a death sentence, made my chest tighten. "They were laughing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About you," Aunt Patricia said. "She said you're too old to notice anything." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork in rough water. "And then she said something about that player she covers. The one on the team you used to coach. She said he's... He trailed off, his face flushing red. I felt the room tilt, the heat from the fireplace suddenly oppressive. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying. Patricia's press badge flashed in my memory, the way she'd been glued to her phone all night, the nervous glances she kept throwing my way. And then it hit me like a fastball to the ribs. She wasn't just covering that player. She was with him. Kevin's eyes filled with tears, and he looked down at his scuffed sneakers. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," he mumbled. "I didn't want to tell you, but I thought you should know." I reached out and pulled him into a hug, his baseball cap pressing awkwardly against my chest. My heart was pounding, a mix of rage and betrayal churning in my gut, but I kept my voice calm. "It's okay, Kevin," I said, ruffling his hair. "You did the right thing." But inside, I was unraveling. Patricia, my wife of 25 years, had been laughing at me, talking about me like I was some senile old fool who couldn't see what was right in front of him. And worse, she dragged our grandson into it. Kevin shouldn't have had to carry that burden. He shouldn't have had to be the one to tell me. I glanced over at Patricia, who was across the room, her press badge gleaming under the chandelier light. She was smiling, laughing with her friends like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just shattered everything we'd built together. My hands clenched into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. For Kevin's sake. "Listen," I said, crouching down again so I could look him in the eye. "This stays between us. Okay? You don't need to worry about any of this. Just focus on your game. You've got a big season coming up, and I'll be there for every pitch." He nodded, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "Thanks, Grandpa," he said, his voice shaky but relieved. "You're still my hero." I managed to smile, even though my chest felt like it was caving in. "And you're mine, buddy. Now go grab some cake before it's all gone." As he ran off, I straightened up, my knees protesting again. I grabbed a crumpled napkin from the bar and wiped the sweat from my forehead, my mind racing. Patricia thought I was too old to notice? Too blind to see what was right in front of me? Well, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The house was too quiet when I got home. The kind of quiet that makes you notice the hum of the fridge or the creak of the floorboards under your feet. Patricia was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine like it was any other Tuesday night. Her press badge was still clipped to her blazer, and she was scrolling through her phone with that half-smirk she gets when she thinks she's untouchable. I didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her phone in my hand. The screen lit up with a thread of messages that made my stomach twist. The kind of messages that weren't about work, no matter how much she might try to spin it. I tapped the screen, holding it up so she could see the timestamp from earlier that afternoon, right around the time she texted me saying she was stuck in a meeting. Her eyes flicked to the phone, then back to me. For a second, I thought she might drop the glass. But then she laughed. That same nervous laugh she used to give when she was caught sneaking out of the house as a teenager. "Scott," she said, her voice too light, too casual. "It's just work stuff. You're being paranoid." Work stuff. I wanted to laugh, but it came out as a dry, bitter sound. The kind of sound you make when you've been punched in the gut but you're too tired to fall down. I glanced at the framed team photo on the wall, me in the middle, grinning like an idiot, surrounded by players who looked up to me like I was some kind of hero. Patricia was in the background, smiling for the camera, her press badge catching the light. Back then, I thought it was just a coincidence. Now I wasn't so sure. "Work stuff," I repeated, my voice low. I didn't raise it. Didn't need to. The weight of the words hung between us like a storm cloud. "You expect me to believe that?" She took a sip of her wine, her hand steady even though her eyes darted away. "Scott, you've been under a lot of stress with the retirement and everything. You're imagining things. Imagining things." The words hit me harder than they should have. I wanted to yell, to throw something, to make her see how much this hurt. But I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, staring at her, the half-empty wine bottle on the counter between us like some kind of pathetic metaphor. "I'm not imagining anything," I said finally, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "But you're right about one thing. I've been under a lot of stress." She opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't stick around to hear it. I walked out of the kitchen, her phone still in my hand, and headed for the garage. The door creaked as I pulled it shut behind me, the sound echoing in the empty space. I sat down on the old folding chair by my workbench, the one I'd had since Kevin was little, and stared at the phone. The texts were still there, glaring up at me like a neon sign. I didn't need to read them again. I already knew what they said, what they meant. But I wasn't going to let her gaslight me into thinking this was all in my head. Not this time. I opened the drawer under the workbench and pulled out a notebook I hadn't touched in years. The pages were yellowed and dog-eared, filled with notes from games long since played. I flipped to a blank page and started writing. Dates, times, names, everything I could remember, everything I could prove. Patricia thought she was smart, thought she could play me like one of her stories. But she'd forgotten one thing. I'd spent 30 years coaching baseball. I knew how to read the signs, how to anticipate the next move. And right now, I was watching her wind up for a pitch I wasn't going to let her throw. The garage was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, but I didn't care. I sat there for hours, writing, planning, until the notebook was full and the wine bottle in the kitchen was probably empty. I wasn't imagining things, and soon neither would anyone else. The garage smelled like old leather and motor oil, the kind of scent that used to feel like home. Now it just felt heavy, like the air was pressing down on me. I sat on the stool, staring at my glove, the one I'd used to teach Kevin how to pitch. The leather was cracked and dry, the laces frayed at the edges. It looked like it belonged to a stranger. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. 30 years of coaching, of teaching kids how to hold themselves, how to stand tall, how to trust their instincts. And now here I was, sitting in the dark, wondering if I'd ever really known anything at all. Patricia's laugh, that nervous, dismissive laugh, kept playing in my head. Scott, it's just work. You're being paranoid. Work, right? Like I hadn't seen the way she'd been looking at him. That cocky kid with the arm like a cannon. Like I hadn't noticed the late nights, the sudden work trips, the way she'd started dressing up for games, even when she wasn't covering them. I set the glove down on the workbench, next to a dusty trophy from my first championship season. The plaque was tarnished, the engraving barely legible. I used to polish that thing every week, back when it still meant something. Now it just looked like another relic, another piece of a life that didn't fit anymore. I cracked open a beer, the sound of the tab popping loud in the silence. The first sip was bitter, warm from sitting in the garage fridge too long. I didn't care. I just needed something to steady my hands, something to keep me from doing something stupid, like calling her, like begging for an explanation I already knew was a lie. The glove caught my eye again, the way it sat there, limp and lifeless. It used to feel like an extension of my hand, like it knew what I wanted before I did. Now it just looked empty, like it had been hollowed out. I picked it up again, running my thumb over the worn pocket where I used to catch fastballs. It reminded me of the first time I'd put it on Kevin's hand, how his eyes had lit up when he realized he could make the ball do what he wanted. That was the thing about baseball, it was all about control. You had to trust yourself, trust your instincts, trust the people around you. And now I didn't trust a damn thing. I set the glove down again, harder than I meant to. The sound echoed in the garage, sharp and final. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let this ruin me, not after everything I'd built. My legacy wasn't just about the games I'd won or the kids I'd coached. It was about the man I was, the man I'd tried to be. And if Patricia thought she could take that from me, she was dead wrong. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Private investigator. I'd never thought I'd need one, but here we were. If Patricia wanted to play games, I'd make damn sure I had the evidence to end it on my terms. I wasn't going to let her destroy everything I'd worked for, not without a fight. The beer can was empty now, crumpled in my hand. I tossed it into the trash with more force than necessary. The sound of it hitting the metal bin satisfying in a way I couldn't explain. The glove was still there, staring back at me like it was waiting for something. I didn't know what yet, but I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The envelope was heavier than I expected. I sat in my truck, the engine off, staring at the dashboard clock. It was 2:17 p.m., the time ticking away like the seconds between pitches in a tied game. My hands didn't shake as I opened it. I wouldn't let them. Inside were the photos, crisp and undeniable. Patricia standing too close to him in the hotel lobby, her hand brushing his arm like it was nothing. Another of them stepping into the elevator, her face tilted up toward his, that stupid press badge still clipped to her blazer. The final shot was the one that sealed it. The hotel room door closing behind them, the player's hand low on her waist. I stared at them for a long time, the sun baking the truck's interior until the air felt thick and sour. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, feeling the weight of it all settle into my chest like a fastball I hadn't seen coming. The investigator, a wiry guy named Frank, had been thorough. He'd slipped me a second envelope, thinner but no less damning. Bank statements, transactions I hadn't made, charges for dinners at places I'd never heard of, boutique hotels with names that sounded like they belonged in a romance novel. She'd been funding their little escapades with our money. My money, earned over decades of early mornings and late nights, of rain-soaked practices and sunburnt tournaments. I flipped through the statements, each one a paper cut. A $400 dinner at some French bistro. A $1,200 charge for a weekend at a vineyard. A $300 shopping spree at a lingerie store I didn't even know existed. And there, in the margins, Frank's neat handwriting. Same days as hotel stays. The hotel keycard was the last thing in the envelope. A cheap piece of plastic, faded from use. I turned it over in my hands, the edges digging into my palms. Felt like holding a piece of something broken, something that couldn't be fixed. I thought about throwing it out the window, watching it skid across the pavement and disappear. But I didn't. I put it back in the envelope, stacked it with the photos and the statements, and tucked it all into the glove compartment. I drove home in silence, the radio off, the hum of the tires on the road the only sound. The house was empty when I got there, the way it always seemed to be these days. I went straight to the garage, to the old desk where I kept my coaching notes and stats sheets. I cleared a space and laid everything out. The photos, the statements, the keycard. I stared at them, my fingers drumming against the wood. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out my old scouting notebook. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed, but it still smelled like dirt and chalk and sweat. I flipped to a blank page and started writing. Names, dates, amounts. A timeline of her betrayal, laid out in my handwriting, the same way I used to map out a player's weaknesses. By the time I finished, the sun had set, and the garage was dark except for the single bulb hanging above the desk. I leaned back in the chair, my hands clasped behind my head, and stared at the ceiling. The anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it wasn't the hot, blinding kind. It was cold, calculated, like the kind of focus you need to call the perfect pitch in the bottom of the ninth. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Patricia had made a mistake. She'd underestimated me just like everyone else. And now she was going to learn exactly what I was capable of. The whistle of the wind cut through the crisp evening air, carrying with it the faint scent of popcorn and freshly cut grass. The scoreboard flickered slightly, its lights buzzing as it tallied the runs for the Little League game. I sat on the dugout bench, my old coaching whistle dangling from my neck, a relic of a life that felt both familiar and foreign now. The chatter from the bleachers carried over. Patricia's friends, their voices sharp and careless, like the crack of a bat against a cheap ball. "Poor Scott," one of them said, her tone dripping with mock pity. "Clueless as ever. Can you imagine? 30 years of marriage, and he's still blind to everything." I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the edge of the bench. The wood was splintered, rough against my palm, grounding me. I could feel the weight of the envelope stuffed in my jacket pocket. Photos of Patricia and him, the star player she'd been covering for her job. The same player who'd been at our house for dinner more times than I could count, smiling like he belonged there, like he hadn't been slipping into my life, inch by inch, while I wasn't looking. But I was looking now. I stood, brushing off my jeans, and made my way toward the concession stand. The line was short, just a couple of parents grabbing hot dogs for their kids. I spotted Bob, one of the dads who'd been coaching alongside me for years. He was leaning against the counter, laughing with the cashier. "Perfect." "Hey, Bob," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "How's it going?" He turned, his face lighting up. "Scott, man, good to see you. Thought you'd be retired from all this baseball stuff by now." "Retirement's overrated," I said with a grin, though it felt tight on my face. "Besides, can't stay away from the game. You know how it is." Bob nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, I get it. It's in your blood. Speaking of blood, how's Patricia? Haven't seen her around much lately." I hesitated, just long enough to make it seem like I was choosing my words carefully. "Oh, you know how it is. She's been busy with work, covering the league, traveling a lot. You'd think she'd have more time now that I'm retired, but I trailed off, shrugging. Bob's brow furrowed. Ah, that's tough. You'd think she'd want to spend more time with you, especially after everything you've done for her. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. Yeah, well, Patricia's always been driven. Sometimes I think she forgets there's more to life than work. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Bob's eyes narrowed, and I could see the gears turning in his head. Good. Let him think. Let him wonder. As I walked away, I glanced over my shoulder. Patricia's friends were still huddled together, their laughter carrying across the field. One of them caught my eye and quickly looked away, her smile faltering. I felt a flicker of satisfaction, cold and sharp, like the first crack of ice on a winter morning. The game ended with a win for our team, the kids cheering as they ran off the field. I stayed behind, leaning against the fence, watching the crowd disperse. The wind picked up again, swirling leaves and empty popcorn bags around my feet. I pulled the envelope from my pocket, flipping through the photos one more time. Patricia's face, flushed and smiling. His arm around her waist, possessive in a way that made my stomach twist. I tucked the photos away and headed for the parking lot. The scoreboard lights flickered off, plunging the field into darkness. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. They thought I was clueless. They thought I was blind. But they had no idea what was coming. And when it hit, it would hit hard, like a fastball to the gut. The magazine hit the stands on a Tuesday morning. I'd been up since dawn, sitting in the garage with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The air smelled like old leather and motor oil, the scent of my glove, still sitting on the workbench where I'd left it the night before. I didn't need to read the article. I already knew what it said. The headline was enough. Star player's scandal rocks the league, and his journalist lover. I lit a cigarette, the flame trembling slightly in my hand. I hadn't smoked in years, but the pack had been sitting in the glove compartment of my truck, untouched since some road trip years ago. The first drag burned my throat, but I didn't care. It felt appropriate, like a punctuation mark to the whole mess. The smoke curled upward, dissolving into the dim light filtering through the garage window. Patricia's phone started buzzing around 8 a.m. I could hear it from inside the house, vibrating against the kitchen counter like a trapped insect. She'd left it there when she stormed out the night before, screaming something about deadlines and deadlines and deadlines. I didn't touch it. Let her deal with it. Let them all deal with it. By noon, the news was everywhere. Twitter, ESPN, even the local sports radio station my neighbor always blasts too loud. I sat in my truck, the engine off, listening to the crackling voices dissect the scandal. The player, some hotshot pitcher with a $10 million contract, was already trending. Patricia's name wasn't far behind. The hosts kept calling her a respected journalist, their tone dripping with mock sympathy. I almost laughed. Respected. Sure. I drove to the gas station and bought a copy of the magazine. The cashier didn't even look at me, too busy scrolling through her phone. The cover photo was grainy but unmistakable. Patricia and the player, their faces too close, their bodies angled toward each other like they were sharing a secret. The caption underneath was brutal, "A love game gone wrong." I tossed it on the passenger seat and drove home. Patricia's car was in the driveway when I got back. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands clutching a mug of tea she hadn't touched. The magazine was open in front of her, the pages spread wide like a wound. She didn't look up when I walked in. "You did this?" she said, her voice low and trembling. "You ruined me." I didn't respond. I just stood there, leaning against the doorway, watching her. Her hair was messy, like she'd been running her fingers through it all morning. Her press badge was still clipped to her shirt, the laminated card askew. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of the world had finally crushed her down to size. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" she spat, finally looking up. Her eyes were red, her mascara smudged. "You're just a bitter old man who couldn't handle the truth." I took a step forward, my boots heavy on the tile floor. "The truth," I repeated, my voice steady. "You mean the part where you betrayed me? Or the part where you lied to my face every damn day?" She flinched, but I wasn't done. I pulled out my phone and opened the bank statements I'd printed earlier. The numbers glared up at her, cold and unyielding. "Or maybe the part where you've been stealing from me to fund your little escapades." Her face crumpled, She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she reached for the magazine, her fingers brushing the cracked screen of her phone. It was still buzzing, notifications piling up like a digital avalanche. I turned and walked out, leaving her there with her tea and her shame. The garage door creaked as I slid it shut behind me, the sound echoing in the empty space. I picked up my glove, running my thumb over the worn leather. It felt heavier than usual, like it was filled with all the things I couldn't say. The cigarette was still burning in the ashtray, a thin trail of smoke rising into the air. I watched it for a moment, then crushed it out with the toe of my boot. The first blow had been struck. Now it was her turn to swing. The front door slammed so hard the windows rattled, and I didn't even flinch. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the divorce papers neatly stacked in front of me, a pen resting on top. The air smelled faintly of the coffee I'd brewed hours ago, now cold and forgotten in the mug. Patricia stormed in, her heels clacking like gunshots against the tile. Her face was red, her hair disheveled, and her usual polished demeanor was gone, replaced by something wild and unhinged. "You ruined me!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She threw her purse on the counter, and it knocked over a vase. Water spilled everywhere, but I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at her like she was a stranger. And maybe she was. The woman I'd married wouldn't have done this, wouldn't have betrayed me, wouldn't have laughed about it behind my back. She marched up to the table, her hands trembling. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she hissed. "My career is over. My reputation is gone. Everyone's talking about me." I slid the divorce papers across the table toward her. "Read them," I said, my voice steady. "Sign them." She stared at the papers like they were on fire. "You think this is going to fix anything?" she spat. "You think you can just walk away and leave me with nothing?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "No, Patricia, you did that yourself." Her eyes widened, and for a second, she looked like she might lunge at me. But then she grabbed the wine bottle from the counter and hurled it at the wall. It shattered, the glass exploding like shrapnel, the red liquid splattering across the floor like blood. She screamed again, a raw, guttural sound that echoed through the empty house. I didn't say a word. I just watched her, my face blank, my hands resting on the table. The silence between us was heavy, suffocating. She was waiting for me to react, to yell back, to beg her to stay. But I was done. Done with her lies, done with her games, done with the life we'd built together, or rather, the life I'd built while she tore it down. "You're heartless," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're just a cold, bitter old man who can't stand that someone actually wanted me." I almost laughed. Wanted her? The player she'd been sneaking around with was probably already moving on to his next conquest. But I didn't say that. Instead, I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Take the papers," I said, my voice low and final. "And get out." She stared at me, tears streaming down her face, but I didn't feel a thing. Not pity, not anger, not even relief. Just emptiness. I walked past her, stepping over the shards of glass, and headed for the garage. The door creaked as I opened it, and the cool night air hit me like a slap. I leaned against my truck, staring up at the stars, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Inside, I heard her crying, the sound muffled by the walls. Part of me wanted to go back, to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay. But that part was small, buried deep under layers of betrayal and hurt. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them, just like I did. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my old coaching whistle, the one I'd carried with me for decades. It felt heavy in my hand, a relic of a life that no longer existed. I tossed it onto the workbench and walked back into the house. Patricia was gone. The divorce papers were still on the table, and signed, but I knew she'd come back for them eventually. She had no choice. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer. "She's gone," I said. "Let's make it official." As I hung up, I noticed the shattered wine glass on the floor, the red stains spreading across the tile. It looked like a crime scene, and maybe it was. Our marriage was dead, and this was all that was left. I grabbed a broom and started cleaning up the mess. The baseball felt familiar in my hands, the leather worn and smooth from years of use. Kevin stood in front of me, his grin wide and his eyes bright, even as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the field. "You're still my hero, Grandpa," he said, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the knot in my chest loosened. I didn't realize how much I'd been holding my breath until that moment. The charity event had been my idea, a way to claw back some of the joy I'd lost. It wasn't just about baseball. It was about proving to myself that I could still stand tall after everything that had happened. The field was alive with kids running bases, parents cheering from the bleachers, and the scent of hot dogs wafting from the concession stand. I had spent weeks organizing it, calling in favors from old players, coaches, and sponsors. The turnout was better than I'd hoped. The community showed up not just for the game but for me, and for Kevin. He'd been my rock through it all. While Patricia's betrayal had left me reeling, Kevin's unwavering faith in me had been a lifeline. That kid had a way of cutting through the noise, of reminding me what really mattered. When he handed me that baseball, it wasn't just a gift. It was a reminder that I still had something to fight for. The charity banner flapped in the breeze above the dugout. The words "Scott's Home Run for Hope" printed in bold letters. It felt good to see my name associated with something positive again, rather than the whispers and sidelong glances that had followed me after the scandal broke. I'd spent too long feeling like a relic, like some washed-up old man who'd lost his grip on life. But out here, with the sound of the bat cracking against the ball and the kids laughing as they chased foul balls, I felt like myself again. Kevin tugged on my sleeve, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Grandpa, can we practice your curveball before the game starts?" He held up his glove, his face eager and hopeful. I ruffled his hair, the way I used to when he was little, and nodded. "You bet, kiddo." As we walked to the pitcher's mound, I couldn't help but notice the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It felt like a new beginning, like the universe was giving me a sign that I was on the right path. Kevin crouched behind the plate, his glove raised, and I wound up, feeling the familiar ache in my shoulder as I let the ball fly. It wasn't my best pitch, but Kevin caught it with a satisfying thwack. "Nice one, Grandpa," he shouted, tossing the ball back to me. I smiled, but it was more than just pride in my pitch. It was pride in him, in us, in the life we were rebuilding together. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes, laughter, and the occasional burst of applause as the game unfolded. I caught glimpses of people watching me, some with curiosity, others with respect. The scandal had made me a cautionary tale for some, but tonight, I felt like I was turning it into something else. A story of resilience, of second chances. By the time the final inning rolled around, the scoreboard lit up with the home team's victory, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Kevin ran up to me, his face flushed with excitement. "We did it, Grandpa," he said, throwing his arms around me. I hugged him back, feeling the weight of the past few months lift just a little more. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. The field, the game, the people, it all reminded me of who I was and who I could still be. And as I looked out at the sunset, the horizon glowing with promise, I knew I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was reclaiming it. The sun was dipping low over the charity baseball field, casting long shadows across the bleachers. The smell of hot dogs and popcorn mixed with the crisp autumn air, and the sound of kids laughing as they ran the bases filled the space with a kind of lightness I hadn't felt in months. The donation box at the entrance was already overflowing, a testament to the community's support. I stood near the dugout, watching Kevin coach a group of little leaguers, his voice steady and confident. He was a natural, just like his old man. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of peace. And then I saw her. Patricia stood at the edge of the field, her hair pulled back, her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. Her hands fidgeted with the strap of her purse, and her eyes darted around the crowd before landing on me. I didn't move. I didn't need to. She was the one who had come here after all. She approached slowly, her heels sinking into the grass. I could see the tear streaks on her face even from a distance, the smudged mascara that made her look more like a ghost than the woman I'd once called my wife. When she finally reached me, she opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off before she could get a word out. "If you're here to donate, the box is over there," I said, nodding toward the entrance. My voice was calm, steady, but there was a sharpness to it that made her flinch. I handed her a donation form, holding it out like it was the only thing she'd ever get from me again. If you want to make amends, start here. She stared at the form, her hands trembling as she took it. Scott, please, she whispered, her voice cracking. I just want to talk. I need you to understand. Understand what? I interrupted, my tone harsher now. That you lied to me? That you betrayed everything we built together? Or that you thought I was too old, too blind to see what was happening right under my nose? I shook my head, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. I don't need to understand anything, Patricia. I already know. Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. But she didn't. She just stood there, clutching that damn form like it was a lifeline. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely audible. I never meant. Stop, I said, cutting her off again. You don't get to say that. You don't get to come here and pretend this is about us anymore. It's not. It's about the kids out there, the community, the people who still believe in what this game stands for. So if you want to do something meaningful, put your money in the box and walk away. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for something. Forgiveness, maybe, or just a shred of the man she used to know. But that man was gone. He'd been replaced by someone harder. Someone who'd learned the hard way that trust isn't something you can just glue back together once it's shattered. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She turned and walked toward the donation box, her steps slow and heavy. I watched as she stuffed the form into her purse and pulled out her wallet, dropping a wad of cash into the box. Then she turned back to me, her eyes pleading one last time. But I was already walking away, toward the field where Kevin was waving me over. The crowd cheered as the first pitch of the evening was thrown, and the sound of it washed over me like a wave, drowning out everything else. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Somewhere behind me, Patricia was still standing there, still trying to find the words to make it all okay. But there were no words, just the crack of a bat, the roar of the crowd, and the steady, unyielding rhythm of the game I loved. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.